I teach in Wageningen University as a landscape architect and urban designer. I have a degree in landscape architecture from Germany and a degree in housing and urbanism from the AA. So we have these old connections. And after I finished my studies, I worked in practice for about 7 years. And during my work, I came across some issues with urban climate. And I started thinking, there is something wrong here maybe. And maybe I should change the way how I am designing. I should devote more attention to this topic. And more or less around the same time, Wageningen University asked me if I want to teach there. So I said, okay, I do that, and I do my PhD about urban climate. And my PhD got a lot of attention, and then the publishers came to me and said, don't you want to write a book about this? And of course I wanted to write this book about this, especially when such an internationally known publisher comes to you with this kind of request. The contents of the book are also based on quite a lot of educational experiences I had already with student groups that have been designing with urban climate. So I think I had some idea how to structure such a book. And the main structure is that, of course, first of all, you have to know what is all this about. And it's, of course, the whole urban climate thing is about how we perceive temperature, if we feel comfortable or not with it. And then we should know, how does this come about? How is urban climate generated, by which kind of physical processes? And then it's also important not just to know how to design for it, but first of all you have to know what are the problems, where are the potentials, so you have to analyze. So I will also give some examples how you can analyze urban climate without having to be a meteorologist, because it's really not necessary. There are so many things we can just do by ourselves. And I will show examples, how you can analyze on a small scale, and also how you can, on a bigger scale, on the mesoscale of the whole city or bigger parts of the city, and how you can design for it or do urban planning for it. Then I focus on what you can do on a smaller scale in terms of analysis and respective design interventions. And I finish with some hints on implementation, because we have a lot of nice design guidelines. The book is full of them, and you can find also some other guidelines and hints in other publications. But how to get it done, that's really a big issue as well. So I reflect a bit on that at the end. So, first of all, what is thermal perception? How do we experience temperature, wind? How do we experience radiation of the sun or heat radiation? And there are also some psychological factors that influence that. I think we all can imagine how this guy is very nicely experiencing the shortwave radiation from the sun. So for him it's really something to enjoy at the moment. But of course, when it becomes too much shortwave radiation from the sun, everybody is escaping the sun. People are cramming in the shady spaces. Only this very brave person is going into the sun to take that one picture. So that's how we can experience urban climate. And of course, the temperature, not only the radiation from the sun, but the air temperatures playing a big role as well. And also how we experience urban climate in many spaces in the Netherlands is that wind is a big factor. And especially on large squares, around tall buildings, people can experience the specific wind patterns around buildings and in open spaces that are generated by the urban fabric. So we can design the urban climate. And just to give a sort of overview, what are now these factors that I've been talking about? Well, the major factor our thermal perception is direct sun radiation, but also the direct radiation that is reflected, for instance, by pavements, by the walls of buildings, etc. That is all the shortwave radiation. And that radiation, it also gets stored in these materials in the city, and it will be emitted as long-wave radiation. So that is what we, for instance, feel when, especially in spring or in autumn, when you're sitting in front of a wall that has been exposed to the sun, but the sun has already gone down, then you can really feel that it's still emitting the heat. And that is the long-wave radiation. So it's really a different type of radiation. Well, also important, of course, air temperature, a bit the relative humidity of the air, the wind. And if we look at other factors that influence it, it is also individual psychological and physiological factors. How old are you? Are you a man? Are you a woman? What kind of activity are you doing? Are you exercising, or are you just sitting in your chair? And some other things. And then the physical factors that are quite important. The thermal complex is described by the long wave radiation, so these kind of things, the short wave radiation, the air temperature, and the relative humidity. And these two are something that we as designers can actually influence very heavily, because once you place something that is casting shadow, you're working on these two. And then there are some other psychological factors, the mood that you're in, the company that you have, and also how you perceive the atmosphere of a space. So there are quite a lot of issues actually influencing how we experience the temperature environment in the city. And of course, there are many things that influence how we experience that. So I give a little bit of an introduction about the urban climate basics, let's say all the physical processes that are going on. And they are about radiation, about the heat that human beings with their activities produce, the air temperature, the urban heat islands, what green areas do, local wind systems, and also wind patterns around buildings, but just in a nutshell. So this is not a lecture about how this all works. It's just to give you some impression. So as I said, the long and short wave radiation are very important for the temperature balance in the cities. The radiation that is emitted by the sun is getting stored in the buildings, and it is also in the night especially emitted as long wave radiation as heat. And that has to do with how the city is configured. If you have, for instance, an open space in the city, all the radiation that has actually come in here, it can also be emitted into all directions. But if it's a very narrow space, all this radiation cannot evade, so it's trapped. And this is causing the heat in the city that you especially experience during the night. Other important factors are also, of course, shadow and sun, and also the materials that you use. For instance, these are infrared pictures. This is showing the same situation. Here you see that all the plants, that they are actually much cooler than this pavement. And these are surface temperatures. Or also on the city scale you can see the same. All the roads are all these red areas here. All the paved areas are actually the warmest areas. So you can imagine that all the pavement, all the stony environment we're creating in the city is generating a different microclimate. And also the activities that we are doing in the city, and that is subsumed under the term of anthropogenic heat. For instance, industry that is emitting a lot of heat, traffic, all the cars have motors that are emitting heat, and also the air conditioners often blow out extra warm air. But also badly insulated buildings, they also add something to the heat balance of a city. So you can imagine that there are many factors that are actually influencing the temperature balance of the city. And actually it was a person from London, Luke Howard, who noticed that the city is actually making a different climate already in 1872, as far as I know. Or 33? Yes, because I always hear about two different dates. Okay. He was actually a sort of hobby meteorologist, and he was recording temperatures in the city, outside the city, and he noticed that there is this temperature difference. So actually here in London, this guy, he invented the urban heat island, as it were, as a term. Well, and this urban heat island, it depends very much where it occurs on the density of buildings, if there is a lot of greenery, how wide or narrow the built-up structure is. And you can see that especially the night temperatures, they show that this urban heat is occurring at night, or let's say the temperature difference between the rural surroundings and the city. And of course it also depends on, for instance, the influence of water bodies. Over day they are cooler here at the pond, but at night they are pretty warm because the water is storing a lot of heat. So all the materials that we're using to make cities, the stony things, the water, the vegetation, or the parks, the planting, the soil that we use, all this has an influence on the urban climate and how the temperatures work in the city. And I think everyone has heard about the urban heat island. But as you can see, it really differs in the different areas of the city, if it's really warm or hot or cooler. And I wouldn't talk about the urban heat island, I would rather talk about a heat archipelago, because it really depends on the structure and the composition of the built-up area, if it's really warm there or not. So you often get pictures like this when you talk about the urban heat areas in the cities. And the influence of green is very, very strong on this. These are measurements that were taken in Toronto. Colleagues actually measured on a bike, and they cycled across these neighborhoods and then through the parks. And you can see that the temperatures in the park significantly go down, and they also slowly rise on the lee side of the park. So the wind that is blowing in here is also carrying the cooler air into the surrounding neighborhoods. So the green has a big influence as well. Also the difference, what is really important is also the difference between warmer and cooler areas, because probably you know that the temperature difference between warmer and cooler areas, they generate wind. The wind is always, warm air is rising up, and you can see the rising up air. It is sort of causing a vacuum over here, so it's making a suction effect. Some architects know it as the chimney effect. But you can also use these systems of the warm air that is rising, and of course it's dragging air from other areas into the urban fabric, and that is normally cooler air, because the cool air is heavier than the warm air, so it's moving very close to the ground. And you can use these kind of systems. So in a densely built up area that is warmer and that is just right next to an open green area that is much cooler, you have quite a big temperature gradient, and then you get local breezes. So up here the warm air is rising and it is sucking in the cool air from here. When the difference between the areas, for instance, just low density housing area, maybe next to a small park, the temperature difference is much smaller, and then you will get much less of these kind of local breeze systems. Based on similar processes is also the wind systems of valley and uphill winds. Actually, in cities where you have valleys that are quite open, you can notice that valley winds are occurring late at night, and they carry fresh and cool air into the city. So, of course, that's an asset. If you can make it available to people living in the city, it's really something you can use. So that these are the small wind systems that are actually occurring due to the temperature difference in the city itself. And then, of course, we have the big wind systems, which are occurring most of the time, and they are quite strong as opposed to the local ones. And these wind systems, they always generate very typical streaming patterns around buildings. If you have been to Canary Wharf, you probably know here the downwash at the foot of the tall buildings. You can see all the ties flapping and people pushing against the wind. So that is actually an effect of, let's say, the tall buildings scooping down the wind, because up here the wind speeds are much higher than on the ground level. So a lot of different wind systems occur around buildings and also in streets and squares. The bigger the squares are, the more space the wind has to pick up speed. So these are all things that, of course, we as urban designers can play with. They're all the elements and building stones that we can change. So we also have a very big influence on wind, because we are the ones who are determining where all these elements are placed, and also, of course, vegetation. So this is, in a nutshell, the basics of urban climate. Now I want to give you some hints on how you can analyze urban climate, first on a bigger scale, and how you can design with it. What I use, and I also describe that more detailed in the book, is the concept of climatopes. And that's based on what you've just heard. It's just sort of thinking further that different urban fabrics have different microclimates. This kind of dense fabric with a lot of stony surfaces will be an urban heat island in our archipelago, right? Whereas this kind of neighborhood with a lot of trees and greenery and very low density will probably be one of the cooler areas in the city, and so forth. So these climatopes, they are describing very characteristic microclimate types in the city, and they very much depend on the types of urban fabrics that we know. High density, low density, a lot of greenery, less greenery, and also some of the human activities. And based on these climatopes, you can make maps, and you don't have to be an expert for that. This map was made by my students in 1 week. So they just got acquainted with the idea of climatopes and analyzed this small town in the Netherlands and made such a climatope map. And they identified the areas where you have higher densities and more heat problems, the wind problems, etc. And they also analyzed the wind patterns around the city and made a wind map about that, looking at where do we have problems, where do we get a lot of turbulences with all these, the downwash winds, etc. And also where can we maybe generate these local breezes. And of course it's also important to look into not only the problems that that are maybe there in terms of the urban climate, but actually who has a problem? It's people. And in many areas where no people live, like in this industrial area, you have an urban heat island area, but people are not staying there at night. So it's not really a problem. Whereas people who are living in the center, and many people live there, you should probably do some interventions. So it's important to bear in mind who is doing what where. And eventually you can come up with, for each city, a very specific recommendation map. Based on all these analyses that you've done, you can say, well, over here you have your heat island area in the city center. Maybe you should do something with greening it, with providing extra shade, etc. And also areas, for instance, that will form sort of green fingers coming into the city for ventilations, that they should be kept free, and so forth. So there are many ways how you can actually make recommendations for small-scale urban design, but also the planning of the total city. And for instance, this could also involve having the valley winds that I talked about earlier, that they can actually come down the hills into the city, so don't block all the hills. And many other interventions can be done. And what is important also to bear in mind is that a lot of small-scale interventions will add up. So the small-scale things that I will be talking about right after this are very important. Adding up these ones is a big issue in changing the urban climate of the whole city. So all the microclimate, small-scale interventions and analysis will be discussed. How can you analyze it, and also what kind of interventions can you do? So I go through this now. On a small scale, what is really important is shadow. What are the shadow patterns? I think a lot of you probably work with 3D rendering software. No? Yeah? Yeah, okay. At least some of you. And you can very easily make this kind of shadow pattern with these softwares. You can overlay them and look in the days when you have the longest and the shortest shadows, and overlap them. Where do we have most shading? Where do we have little shading? And based on that, you can continue coming up with your design interventions. You can also use a more sophisticated software like EnviMat, but very often this is really sufficient. For wind, analyzing is something that either you do based on your basic knowledge, like this, is often already giving a lot of good information. Once you understood how these flow patterns work, you can already arrange a lot of buildings in a smart way. But if it has to be smarter, then maybe it should be put into the wind tunnel, or you have computational fluid dynamics analysis done. But that is the expert work. And a very different way of analyzing is something that I introduced in my PhD research. I actually, instead of making a lot of measurements and computer simulations, I just went out to the spaces and asked people about their microclimate perception. And once you ask a lot of people, and they all say, well, this place is very comfortable because it's always shaded, here it's too sunny, there too windy, blah blah blah. And if you overlay them, then you also get a very good and useful picture, because you're basically designing for people, right? We are not designing for the computer that is doing the simulations. So these kind of mental maps can be also a very useful method to actually get a grip on the microclimate in certain spaces. And then there are many interventions. You can intervene, especially as an architect, on a lot of shade casting, elements. For instance, with awnings and roofs, or you can use movable elements to shade the streetscapes. Buildings, of course, here the galleries, or what is really interesting, the old market halls. In former times they were actually using these column halls as a market underneath the town halls. So this was well ventilated, shaded, perfect for keeping your produce as fresh as possible when there were no fridges yet. So, and of course, I, as a landscape architect, of course, I prefer to use vegetation for shading, and it has a big advantage. It's not only shading the trees, they also evaporate a lot of water and thus also temper the air temperature. So when you use vegetation, you're actually always using two knobs on the panel that you can use for influencing the urban climate. And also on a smaller scale, you can use a lot of green elements. Also, parking lots are probably well shaded with trees. And even if there are places where you would like to have some sun in the winter, you can use plants that have very big leaves in summer, but they just lose them in winter. And that is also a nice thing about deciduous trees. They lose their leaves in winter. That's when you want to have sun intruding into the urban fabric or into your yard or whatever. So that's another big advantage of vegetation. It is actually providing shade when you need it and not providing much shade when you don't want shade. Apart from that, you can of course also use water, but it's important that the water is moving. So when you think, let me put a pond in my garden and it will cool down my garden, it won't really work. It will temper the air temperature a little bit, but the water is also storing heat. So make sure that it's moving and evaporating as much as possible. Then for wind protection, you can of course also do a lot of interventions. Very artistic wind screens at the coast in the Netherlands, for instance, or maybe a bench at the coast in Palm Beach in Florida that has to be protected from the wind with some hedges. And you can also think about other types of interventions. For instance, at the tall buildings against the downwash, put awnings or step buildings or dense vegetation. So there are many, many things that we can do. And in my book you can find many more. So I will not go into depth for all of them. But it's not only about blocking the wind. We also want to allow some ventilation sometimes. So, for instance, when you have a place where you get these local breezes between a warmer and a cooler area in the city, don't block them with dikes or very dense building or also very dense planting. You actually want the cool air from this area penetrate into the built fabric. Or also when you design a house and a garden. I wouldn't block everything here with hedges and trees, because you also still want to have some ventilation when you open your window. So, ventilation is also an important issue to think about. And then also human experience, how people experience the materials of spaces, or that when they are in big open spaces that they feel, oh, I have a sort of comfort island, that they're not just feeling exposed like in the desert. And use materials that are quite light, but also have sort of warm colors. Here in England and in the Netherlands, etc., people prefer these kind of colors and they get a warmer, more comfortable feeling from that. Well, last but not least, some words about implementation. So how can we get all this done? How do we get people going in order to change our environments. Of course, you can start doing something with legislation, and I know that English people don't like this, and this will be a very, very nice point for our discussion. And I see Michael, he is very keen on talking about that. And of course, education and communication. So, legislation, as opposed to what you can find here in the UK, there are some countries who like legislation a bit more and obeying to the rules. And one of them is Germany, and especially the city of Stuttgart has been a kind of, how do you say that? They were the first ones globally who introduced doing measurements about urban climate, and really in different places, and also trying to do the city planning accordingly. They have 70 years of experience in that. And Michael knows everything about it. So maybe you want to reflect a bit more on Stuttgart later, so I don't talk too much about that, right? But they did urban climate maps a long time ago. You see here the plan graphics. It's really nice old-fashioned stuff. And they analyzed where the warm areas are, where the cold air flows go, etc., etc. And Stuttgart is situated in a sort of valley, and in this valley they have a lot of problems, or used to have a lot of problems with smog. So they have noticed that once we allow enough ventilation coming into this valley, we can actually do something about these smog problems. And that really had big implications. First of all, on the big scale of the city planning, in Germany they have something which is called the Flächennutzungsplan. That's a big-scale land use plan where they fix the green areas in the city, the residential areas, the industrial areas, and all kind of different land uses. And actually they have really safeguarded all these green areas that are on the hills around the city center, that they have to stay green and open. And there's no discussion about that. This is a legally binding plan. So, if Mercedes-Benz and Porsche, they all have their firms there, they all have their factories there, they would like to expand over there, but forget it, it won't happen. And they also actually translated this into a smaller scale, which is facing these kind of ridges of the hills going down into the city center. These are all these flanks of the hills, and they made, again, much more detailed climate analysis. Where do we have the ventilation paths that are now really going down in here? Where are the bottlenecks? And actually they also then made a plan what should happen. They also translated all this into zoning plans for all these areas on the flanks of the hills. So these are basically the slopes, and this is the city center. And they changed quite a lot of the existing zoning plans according to the to the new aims based on the urban climate, and especially ventilation. So this is giving some idea what you can do with legislation, really top down. What I think is also very important is actually that people learn to play and to think with urban climate from an early age on. So students, they are our asset. We have to educate them quite early to think about urban climate and how it works, and that is also very fascinating to design with it. But it's also important to have professionals working on this. And you see how enthusiastically they are crafting on a microclimate responsive design for a public square here. So it's also about lifelong learning. And I'm also now working on a lifelong learning project, actually also together with people from the TCPA, which you probably know. So they are part of this consortium, and we have developed a course for professionals. and the course is called Klimcap. We are now running the pilot, and people are very enthusiastic. They really think like, oh wow, this is cool. We can do this and this with urban climate, and I can really do something. So it's really interesting once people get involved. And nobody has dropped out. We thought like, oh, there will be, and it's next to their professional work. So they work in the weekends, in the evenings, and still no dropouts. So that's really great. And I can just, stimulate. Don't only teach young students, also teach professionals. And another very important strand, I think, is communication. Making people aware that there is something like urban climate, that there are problems, that there are potentials. And this is showing the unveiling of the first urban climate tree of the world. And we inaugurated this tree last year. And it has a sort of piece of art. It's a ring made of corten steel with some kind of words about what a tree makes for urban climate, and it was unveiled by the alderman of the city of Arnhem. So doing things like this, making people aware with maybe playful, artful events and interventions. And last but not least, of course, use the media to inform people about problems, about potentials. And in the Netherlands, we are now, I think, at a stage that we can say, yes, there is awareness now. During the last heat wave, suddenly the newspaper were all over, full with urban climate and heat, and we have to plant more trees, etc., etc. And for me, that was, of course, a moment where I thought, yes, mission accomplished. And I hope that my book will further this kind of process that we can say mission accomplished. That's really now that people have the awareness that they also start doing something, that they start removing all the tiles from their gardens and plant more trees, etc., etc. So that is in a nutshell the contents of my book, and I hope it was enlightening for you. You got a good impression. And then I give the word to Michael.
Thank you.